If you guys have something small I want to go in the meantime, go for it.
Well, we have a pretty interesting update ourselves, which is not necessarily small. And Kent, do you have an update?
What we're about to present? I do have a couple questions, and I do have an update too.
Oh, okay, great. Well, why don't you go ahead and give your update, and then we can see where we are. And
Well, I guess specifically for Nate, I posted a description of a round robin filter on top of the current Casper layer in the CBC Discord chat, and Nate, you replied with the fact that there is currently a definition of liveness, and I was just wondering, if you could give a link right now or something, that would be nice.
Yeah, I don't have that specific paper thing that has it in it typed up nicely is in a nice state, but I will send you something like by the end of the day today, or like within the next hour or two.
Okay, cool. That would be great.
Yeah, real quick though, it's essentially the definition of liveness that Vlad presented in Boulder, was it, at the RChain Dev retreat thing, in his FLP proof. It's pretty much saying that eventually we're going to reach a safe place. Was the definition? If you remember that, just to
So it's the one that there was a way of stating it with the, I guess, the states that won't ever be reached.
You can kind of think about it. You can kind of think about it in terms of like traces of protocol state, like a trace of a specific protocol state execution, kind of. And if we can kind of say like, every protocol state execution, let's say, terminates. And when I say terminates, I mean it ends in safety. That's essentially what we're thinking about liveness is now. And so what you're doing when you say like round robin filter is like, ideally what we're able to do is we're able to like, come up with a synchrony assumption / strategy that is like a filter on top of the protocol state space. And then with that filter, we're able to prove that, every trace has like a, finite length or something of a valid protocol execution. And that's like enough for us to say, okay, like, in this synchrony assumption with these strategies, it's going to be live. I mean, so the point there, right, is that like we're on a bit more of a rigorous notion than just like, wait 6 seconds and then, or, they didn't send you it last time, wait 12 seconds, So
yeah, that makes sense.
It's a work in progress though. I think, the biggest missing piece is like figuring out how to actually express these synchrony assumptions and strategies. It's not super simple. One thing that's interesting is that it could be much, much simpler. It seems like it might be simpler if we move to a like row calculus presentation of Casper in general. It's easier. It seems easier to represent strategies once we have programs.
That's exactly what happened with the game semantic stuff, right? So Hyland and Ong, they're using games as objects and strategies as morphisms, and the interpretation of linear logic proofs are morphisms in this setting. So they're having to do lots and lots of calculations with strategies, and then Ong observes that, oh well, if I just write down the strategies as bicalculus programs, my life becomes much easier.
That's really interesting. I'll bother you about that later today as well. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. I also wanted to follow up on what you said about passing or not having to pass the entire DAG.
Oh, right. This was the question about validator set rotation, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I agree with you that if we only care about the current block's fault tolerance that the safety oracle gives, then if we have 2 perfect rounds of round robin, then that's enough for anyone to run the safety oracle and then say that, oh well, it has a fault tolerance of point whatever, and then except the issue is that only gives you a it only gives you the fault tolerance conditionally
Yeah,
on
right.
the fact that the previous block is finalized, right?
Yeah, totally. So the question essentially is like, when we rotate the validator sets, the way we do it means that the validator sets can rotate before achieving finality, from the first validator set. So pretty much the idea here is that like clients might have to look at more information, which seems to be fine to me. Essentially, like for efficiency reasons, we're not actually going to rotate the validator set like particularly frequently. Like it's probably most realistically it shouldn't be every block. And so you can imagine rotating the validator set every 100 blocks or every 1,000 blocks or something. And then in this case, like clients have to look at they have to look at the most recent messages, and they also have to look at like the 1,000 block kind of border conditions where the validator set might have rotated, if that makes sense.
Well, there's I think there ought to be like condition based or event based notions of rotating the validator set rather than just the number of blocks. There ought to be
So can you give an example of one of these events?
Well, obviously, if a validator gets slashed, you might want to consider.
Totally. Yeah. So great. Yeah. So in cases like that, it seems fine to rotate the validator out before the kind of boundary condition. But for efficiency reasons, like the kind of the general purpose, people are leaving and joining just because it's time for that to happen. It seems like it makes sense to do it kind of on some well-known boundary, and so like clients don't have to look at everything.
So one question I have is that if you have a validator that gets rotated out because they were slashed, then the timing of that is pretty arbitrary, right? And so you could use the like if you're about to get slashed, you can sort of use that in a, I guess, double fashion almost. If like clients are going to assume that, I guess, validator rotation only happens every 1,000 blocks or whatever, then you can equivocate and then get slashed, but maybe your like clients will assume that you have the previous validator set, so you can, I guess, doubly affect the protocol on your equivocation. Is that not a concern?
I'm not sure where the double effect comes from. I agree with you that like equivocation can lead to safety failure, and like clients could get tricked. But I guess I don't understand like what the claim is about like double. Like
so I see. I guess it's just the fact that they won't be able to pick it up as quickly as validators who have been validating. Yeah, I see. So in general, there's no known way to detect that yet, though.
When you say detect that, do you just mean
like without validating?
You just mean like an equivocation?
Yeah. Or
I mean, you can. I'm not sure this is exactly what you're asking, but you can imagine we could like produce a succinct proof that two blocks are equivocations with respect to each other and from one validator, and then like you can imagine like sending that around to like clients or something. I guess I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but like we can give like clients proofs that people are equivocating, namely the blocks that they're equivocating with, right? And like maybe some relevant data from the justifications.
Yes, that is true, because that is what we use for slashing proofs. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
We do have Mike and Nash on today because they want to talk about some interesting questions with respect to uh, uh, the block rewards and validator rewards that's relevant to all of this discussion. And I just want to make sure that we leave enough time for that discussion. So if there are other updates that we want to get in, if we could get them in
Yeah,
relatively. Go ahead.
I can go fairly quickly.
Okay.
I'll just share like a kind of high level overview of the last week or so. So Vlad and I have been pushing forward on the paper. The main thing, so Vlad, I don't know if he was here last week, I missed the stand up, but he has a representation of our clique oracle, right? Which is like kind of like our best lower bound oracle that we have right now. And so currently we're attempting to prove that we kind of have a massive proof obligation to show that, the clique oracle actually satisfies the definition of estimate safety. So, the clique oracle is this thing of like, greater than half see each other agreeing and they can't see each other disagree later. And so pretty much right now we're in the process of trying to prove that it does satisfy our definition of estimate safety. We kind of have some ideas about how to do this. The general structure, it's kind of interesting, is to show that, if you have a clique in some protocol state, then you will have a clique in the next protocol state, where the next is like, defined in terms of these minimal transitions. Like, if you have a clique and you receive one extra message, you're going to maintain the clique. And then we can essentially, make an inductive argument to some degree of like, okay, if you have a clique at some height, you're going to have it at all future heights. And so, it does satisfy our definition of estimate safety. So yeah, so that's kind of the first main thing we've been working on. The other thing relevant to Casper research, and also maybe the questions that you guys are going to talk about, or the things you guys are going to talk about, is we've started to do some work. Me, Vlad, and a fellow named Ben Jones, who I'm sure you guys will see around, have been doing some work on like Casper economic stuff, in terms of just like kind of solving basic equilibrium equations, et cetera. And coming up with kind of like model games and stuff. I'll present really quickly the model game, and then I'll end the update. But so pretty much, we consider imagine like n agents, and they each have 3 possible strategies, where the strategies are either go offline, stay online and be honest, or stay online and try to censor other validators. And then we pretty much have a normal form game where, essentially if greater than, or essentially what we can say is, if greater than half of the people are online and censoring, then everyone who's just online is going to appear to be offline. And so essentially here's what we do. We relate the strategies of the validators to information that the protocol itself could see about the validators. So the validators have 3 possible strategy choices, but in the end, all the protocol can really see is whether or not these people are online or offline. And so we try and essentially, we're trying to currently kind of figure out the equilibriums in these games where the protocol kind of has imperfect information about whether or not people are offline or just being censored, with clear kind of ties to why we would want to do this for Casper. So yeah, that work is like, at least for me, kind of just beginning, but it's super cool and super exciting, and hopefully we'll have some like interesting kind of results / model games to present in sometime soon.
Cool. That all sounds very, very interesting, actually. Yeah. We definitely want to go a little bit further in terms of the equilibrium dynamics to get to, sort of economic models. That's something that we really need to go ahead and flesh out. I mean, Vlad and Vitalik and I were, thinking that way for quite some time, but we need to write it all down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Anything else?
That's it for me. Thanks.
Sweet. Mike, Nesh, you guys want to give it a go?
So we're talking about how to reward validators, and We think it is not possible to issue block rewards because validators can just magic up anything. Greg would like to have some kind of measure of utility of a block.
Sorry, real quick. I know you haven't gone far, but so when you say we can't issue block rewards because validators can magic up anything, we're talking about kind of invalid state transitions where they just kind of give themselves.
No, not invalid state transitions, but just generating junk blocks. That it doesn't cost anything to produce a block, so there's no point in rewarding the production of a block.
So
like to
also
have some kind of measure of utility so that you can reward useful blocks, but that is, in my mind, far too vague and gameable. We are doing a sort of debugging style thing to verify that a validator is doing the work required to keep up to date with the rolling state. So present a challenge pair where one of the blocks is invalid and the validator has to tell which one it is. If they're doing enough work to keep up to date, that's all the work that anyone else has to do. So they might as well be rewarded for their work, whether they're generating blocks on behalf of users or not is sort of irrelevant. Users will pick validators to submit code to based on any number of criteria. There's no need to reward or punish one for accepting blocks from users or not.
So the thing I'd push back with there is that like your heuristics for users get a lot more complicated now. Like ideally, if we can tie the validators down to just saying, these are the people who will be making blocks, and if they aren't making blocks, you can be sure they're going to be punished. We kind of give users much nicer guarantees because they don't have to reason about validator A is reliable, validator B isn't. They can just kind of say, I know that I trust the validator set because if they're not being reliable and using my transactions pretty much, or kind of submitting my transactions or acting on behalf of me as a user, which is kind of, I guess, what we want. I would argue that like things get a lot more complicated for users. The second thing I wanted to kind of push back against is that
in which scenario do they get more complicated?
In cases where in cases where kind of users have to use more complicated heuristics about essentially the question of like the point that you made about, keeping up with the state is good enough. We don't necessarily need them to be generating blocks on behalf of users.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what validators really are doing at that point. I mean, like, so they're validating, sure. But like producing blocks for users, I would argue is kind of one of their main responsibilities. And if some validators
but you can't control from the system which validators the users choose to send their traffic to. Every large scale distributed system on the internet, users send traffic unevenly, right? And even when you have fairly good schemes for distributing traffic across a bunch of different systems, you don't get a fair distribution of traffic, right? So rather than try to solve load balancing as a problem in order to implement our consensus protocol, we're just sort of admitting that it's not an easy, that's a separate issue, and that the block production is related to how much user traffic you get and not how much validation you do. And the core thing that we want validators to do is perform validation and run the smart contracts and maintain the current tuple space, right? Now, this is somewhat our chain specific, but that's the functional requirement of a validator in our chain, right? They don't actually have to do anything else. And if the users don't send them any queries, then they won't do anything else. They'll just sit there validating the blocks they get from other validators, right? So rewarding the validators that get all the traffic is essentially, a way of discouraging people whose validator IP address or domain name or what have you is poorly known from validating anything. We don't want to do that.
Okay. So the other problem I see here, or the other thing that could become a problem, is that So sorry, I guess a point I want to make instead is that we totally can A, give a block reward, and B, enforce that block rewards are only given to validators who are kind of doing the right thing, right? Like, we have these protocol states. We have knowledge of what has happened. You know, we know who has seen what and who made messages where, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, in the case where a validator starts making millions of messages just to collect block rewards, doesn't include transactions, it's like very apparently visible, right? And so depending on how we specify these strategies that validators are supposed to follow, which I think is absolutely something that we need to do, and it doesn't sound like it's going to happen in this current version. We kind of aren't even really saying that we're going to hold validators accountable, right? Like, in one situation, we could say validators produce blocks whenever they have enough transactions to do so. But I think more reasonably, and actually, in my opinion, it's probably easier to specify and a lot easier for users to use, ultimately, would be saying validators have to produce blocks like this. We're going to pay them if they produce blocks like this. And if they don't produce blocks like this, it kind of, when I say like this, I mean in this shape, in this DAG, then we're going to punish, right? And, you know, we'll punish them on the order of their transgressions. If they really screw up, you know, they're really going to be hurting, right? And so, you know, I'm totally unconvinced that giving block awards is bad because validators could just make a lot of blocks, because we are totally have the freedom to specify whatever.
No, that's so yes.
The problem is
I agree that that's not a very compelling argument. It's just one of two arguments. The problem is that if you give block rewards based on block production, then they are skewed towards those validators that receive user traffic, and it's unfair to validators that have contributed hardware and physical resources to the network but aren't getting any user traffic for whatever reason.
Wait, this is if there is block reward, if there isn't block reward.
If you reward for block production, then you are rewarding people who receive user traffic.
Why?
Because they're the ones that get to produce blocks.
No, I mean, you
no.
know,
If you're not getting any blocks, if you're not getting any user transactions, you won't produce any blocks.
you totally still could. I mean, unless you have a provision that says blocks must be full, in which case validators are just going to insert fake transactions. I think it's like totally reasonable for validators to make blocks, even when they don't have all the transactions in the world to fill them up, right? Like, you know, I would actually argue it's significantly more unfair in the case of no block rewards, and without strategies, because now the only people who are making blocks are validators who receive all the transactions. Whereas in the other case, we can specify for validators, you're going to make blocks at this interval, no matter what, whether or not you have enough transactions to fill it. It seems much more fair, that if you kind of, at least to some degree, try and encourage fairness, rather than just saying the people who make all the blocks are the people who get all the transactions, and also there's no block reward. I mean, that seems like definitely the only people making money are the people who are receiving the transactions, right? There isn't anyone else.
Well, so something else we didn't specify here thus far is the assumption is that all transaction fees are split among the whole validation pool.
Equally?
Equally.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Unless you get kicked out for not validating, which is the point of the challenge protocol. Basically, the challenge protocol is saying, hey, are you doing your work over there? Yes, you are. Great. You can keep participating in our shared pool of rewards. If not, then you get kicked out.
Okay. The challenge protocol sounds interesting. I might have some questions, but real quick, the one thing I would want to point out is that I'm not sure if you guys have looked into something. They're called like gold finger attacks or something. I'm not sure exactly what they're called, but pretty much these more complicated transaction fee designing schemes sometimes like induce these kind of weird sub games where validators have incentive to like not perform how you would expect them to, like not include transactions for some reason or other because they're not getting all the rewards from them or something like that. And so there's been, I guess the point that I'm making is that there's been a fair bit of work thinking about splitting up rewards between the validator set. And I don't have a specific example, but I would look into it for sure because there's kind of been a fair bit of research on it that I think you guys might benefit from. It's cool stuff for sure. Not that I've looked into it a ton. Okay, the next question I guess is like, what's this challenge protocol thing?
what I mentioned earlier about debugging, that you put in invalid things on purpose to see if others will detect them.
Okay, so do you have a way of determining when someone is allowed to put in invalid things?
Yeah.
So, like,
Go ahead, Kyle.
one thing that I had suggested is putting one invalid COM event in every block. And then the way that you reference a block is not by its hash, but by the hash of the invalid COM event in the block.
So wait, I mean, couldn't I put an invalid COM event, one of the same invalid COM event in two different blocks? The hash thing, I'm not sure I totally understand, but I hear you.
Concatenation of the two, right? Like this block, and by the way, there's the question and answer, and you can make it so that that in order to reference the block, you encrypt it with like your own public key, so that others that know the answer can verify that you knew the answer, but it's not even a zero knowledge proof. It's a both knowledge proof.
So it seems like what we're okay. So pretty much, the scheme that we're looking for. So somehow introducing a COM event into a bad COM event into every block, seems like it's not enough for me. It seems like it's not enough for the game. It seems like we need to have like this kind of element of surprise thing to it. Like if there's an invalid COM event in everything, you can imagine, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to figure out. Okay, every block is technically an invalid block, right? And so it's like you have to be watching in some ways, but also like you can deviate in the same way as before, like because so I guess here's the point. Essentially, what I guess I feel like we need is kind of some way of randomly determining when blocks are going to be invalid, and that way validators sometimes feel like they can cheat, and that way we can actually catch them. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if you actually analyze an invalid thing in every block. I don't know if the equilibrium of that game is people actually validating.
Well, it depends on sort of how we interact with light clients a little bit, and the reason is you can't make the tuple space unless you've been following the whole time, right? You get transactions, you update your tuple space, you get transactions, you update your tuple space. And so if we have light clients that are not keeping track of the tuple space constantly, they only care about it infrequently, and they can ask for a copy of the tuple space, then there's a problem, right? Because a validator could pose a light client, ask for a recent tuple space, and then only validate like one block, or something like this, right? Basically, the ways in which you can cheat depend on how we're exposing the tuple space, because the basic proof that
so I guess here's what I'd say. Any solution that involves not totally opening the tuple space seems like a total non-solution to me, because we probably very, very, very much so do not want to encourage validators to like hide the state to themselves and not show it to everyone. Like, that's kind of what we're providing to people, is like visible knowledge of the global state. And so like hiding the tuple space, any solution that relies on that sounds like a solution that also introduced like, the kind of like a real bad thing on the side that like we definitely don't want. Like light clients need to be able to request the tuple space. They totally need to be able to do that, because if they can't, then like, realistically, the only thing they can check is whether or not a transaction was included, which is like totally not so useful, right? It's like we can make light clients that are extremely useful if they have the ability to access state. And so hiding it seems like a really crazy thing to do.
Yeah, so Kent had suggested at some point possibly doing like a delay on it. So there's a period in which the tuple space isn't made available to light clients, and during that time is when you catch the cheaters for the validators, and after that everything is revealed.
Give them the non-confirmed state.
I think light clients would find that very useful. I think there are other ways that we could like do this kind of game of catching the bad guys, that are kind of the non-validators that doesn't revolve around not giving things to light clients. And also, I'm not sure you'd be able to, like, with this challenge protocol, it very much seems like we're going to have a kind of a hardcore synchrony assumption, or otherwise you get in trouble. Okay,
yeah,
so let me.
That's the confirmed state Kyle just mentioned. You only give them stuff that the network, that the node believes is safe.
Right, but I guess the point I was trying to make is that in the actual challenge, right? Like, you challenge someone and you say, produce evidence that you've been validating or something. Show me evidence that you've been validating. Whatever the signature thing is on, the hash of the most recent invalid com event or something. Their response is like, if they don't respond in 6 blocks, we're going to slash them. It seems like we need to do that if we're making like clients wait until we've challenged them, right? And so there we have like kind of a hardcore synchrony assumption, where the trade-off is, as long as the synchrony assumption is, as long as we're going to make we're going to make like clients wait. And so like the safer we make it by making this, or the weaker we make the assumption, the longer like clients have to wait, which is like not so great. And it seems like there's kind of a direct trade-off there. Okay, so real quick, let me present a kind of a sketch thing, an alternative game that I think Vlad and Vitalik came up with at some point, and maybe some other people. I'm not an expert on it, and I do wish Vlad was here, but I think he probably will be next week and talk about it more. But I'll just present the idea so you guys can think about it. The idea is that we give imagine each validator kind of has some amount of private randomness. So imagine we have like a random number generator on chain, and validators also have like a private randomness thing that allows them to kind of, for each block, kind of derive a random number just for themselves that only they can see, that they can also prove is like, the correct random number from this specific block. The point here is that we allow validators to, imagine we say, oh, when the random number on chain is like less than 1,000, or sorry, when it's like, greater than 1,000 times the private randomness, then validators can make an invalid block if they are next. So pretty much what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it so validators can randomly make invalid blocks in a valid manner. And when I say in a valid manner, I mean they can later justify to the protocol, when it looked like I was making an invalid block, I'm not actually evil. I had the right to do this. And that's kind of what our private randomness gives us, without kind of revealing that to all the other validators. And then what we say is that any validator who signs on top of an invalid block like this gets slashed, right? And so now we kind of have a scheme where we don't necessarily have to make light clients wait. It maybe gets a little tricky because maybe we do, because now there are invalid blocks floating around. But maybe light clients wait on their end for like, T+1 kind of confirmations on that thing. And so we make a fault tolerance assumption for validity. But now we kind of, instead of having a challenge protocol, we just say, oh, if you're any one of these people who signs on top of this invalid block, then you are bad and you are evil and we will slash you. And so maybe it doesn't require a synchrony assumption in terms of the challenge, if that makes sense.
I think that protocol needs a little bit of refinement, because the sort of, I guess, solution to cheating in the presence of these things is to never be the first person to, I guess, like, once you see someone sign on top of a block, you can fork and sign on top of it on the other side, type of thing. Just never be the first person to sign on a block. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's an equilibrium. If that's equilibrium, if you expect everyone else to be deviating. But I think the interesting thing here is it doesn't seem stable to me, because as soon as people start doing that, then essentially kind of, like everyone starts deviating. And so no one's checking. And so people actually are signing invalid blocks, right? Like, it doesn't seem at all to be a stable equilibrium to do that. And also on top of that,
it's a mixed strategy thing, right? Like there's not going to be a single strategy equilibrium. There's going to be like an equilibrium number of cheaters supported in this system.
Oh, I mean, not necessarily. Like, we could totally make it so I'm fairly confident we can build like protocols that the equilibrium is like everyone follows the protocol totally.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I'm just saying that as presented, I don't think that is
fair. Okay, yeah. I think it at least needs more analysis for sure. And we don't have like great models of it. But I guess the one more thing I'd say is like, are you guys sure that this is necessary for V1?
Well, so we've been talking for a little while about validator rewards, and so this has been sort of the result of the most recent discussions. But I guess the short answer is no, we're not certain that this, as described so far, is like what we need to go with.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the.
But we need to make a decision now because it has to be implemented by testnet. I mean, there's no time left to choose something else unless you can find ways that this breaks horribly. We've got to implement something. So
yeah, I mean, I'd love to find ways that this breaks horribly. If you guys have a write up of it or something, I'd love to like look it over in more detail and try and break it even more, or try and break it, I guess I'll say.
But the interesting point here, though, is that you feel that block rewards are definitely possible within the proof of stake, just on the basis of the justification structure.
Yeah, so I think we kind of have arbitrary control over validator rewards.
But so far, right, the team has been unconvinced of this particular idea. So let's talk through that a little bit more in a little bit more detail, so that we have a sense of how convincing this position is. So can you give a sketch of validator rewards that feels a little bit more compelling?
Yeah, that's a great point. Let me try. So the general idea here is that we can have a smart contract on chain or a piece of code on chain that is somehow distributing rewards to people, right? So you can imagine in the most simple version, like, all fees collected by blocks go into the central pool, and when validators leave, they get their portion of it, or however it works out.
Mm-hmm.
In your specific case, that seems like the first thing that you thought, or the kind of what you're going with currently, I guess I'll say.
Yeah.
But we can have the smart contract have arbitrary control over how much the validators get when they leave, I guess is what I'll say, or get during, or something like that. And so the point here is that we have two things here. The first thing is that we have access to their deposits, and the second thing is that we have access to the history, right? Because when we're in this smart contract, you can imagine the smart contract could somehow query the node and say, oh, what happened here? And the reason that we have justifications in the first place, at least to some degree, let me rephrase that. One of the great benefits of justifications is that we have a lot of information about what's happened in the past, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We can see who communicated with what, where and when and why and what happened. We don't have perfect information because, like, when A sends a message to B and it doesn't get there, it's not clear if A didn't send the message or B didn't receive it, right? So we can't attribute everything all of the time. But what we can do is we can kind of have a pretty good overall understanding of who made messages when and kind of what went on. And so what this allows us to do is it allows us to arbitrarily reward validators and punish validators, which are kind of the same thing, into doing exactly what we want them to do. And so I would say that it might be easiest now to just say to validators, build in a round robin. We'll pay you the most if you do a perfect round robin. The farther you stray from a round robin, you're going to get punished. And also we have a condition in there that if you make 6 blocks in a row to collect block rewards, or you're making an unfair proportion of blocks, you're not going to be making as much as if you just made in the proper order. And so essentially the idea here is that we can essentially say to validators just straight up, but just based on the fact that we have access to their deposits and minting, and the fact that we have access to history, we can say, you will make the most money if everyone is doing what they are supposed to. And collectively, you will make less money if you deviate from the protocol that we specify here, where I'm saying protocol here to mean building this specific DAG.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just seems like there's no point in bothering to have Casper and all the elegant properties of Rolang if you're going to degenerate the consensus algorithm to be DPoS. You might as well just go buy EOS tokens.
Oh no! I mean,
right? This is exactly the.
No, round robin is very, very, very much not the same as DPoS. And I'm not talking here about like subjective, if people don't seem like they're following the protocol, vote them out. It's like kind of an objective thing. It's like, here's collectively how you make the most money. And it's much. It's nothing like DPoS. It's
This
actually
is just
right?
that round robin systems do not work very well in large scale distributed systems.
Oh, I hear you. Okay, so sorry. Let me not say round robin. Let me not say round robin. Let me just instead say some DAG.
Some DAG shape.
DAG round robin's easy to use and everyone has a vision of it. But I can say some DAG where, maybe that means 2 concurrent round robins or every 6 validators, random validators, build blocks at every height, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that we have a lot of flexibility. Casper doesn't at all specify what the shape of the DAG we end up building is. And that's the purpose of giving validator strategies. And moreover, that's what we can use our incentives for. We're using our incentives to bind the hell out of the validators. I don't think we want them to have the freedom of choice to build any arbitrary DAG they want just based on who receives the most transactions, right? What we really want is we want validators to predictably produce blocks how we expect them to. Maybe not predictably in that maybe random ones do it for, DOS reasons. But we totally have the ability to specify this at a strategy level. And this is actually what we can use rewards and incentives for. And it's nothing like DPoS at all because they're totally bound to the protocol. That's the whole point. In a way that not proof of work doesn't do it. DPoS doesn't do it. Nothing else does it in a way that we can do it with proof of stake. And also with Casper because we have so much information. Because we have justifications, we literally have all the possible information, right? I mean, that's hand wavy, but it seems like we have all of the information we could possibly have.
Okay, so certainly, I agree that we have a kind of a saddle point with respect to the information that we could have, or an inflection point with respect to the information we could have. I also agree that we can constrain the shape of the DAGs using justification. That's kind of that's its raison d'etre. So I'm totally on board there. But what that does do though is it pushes the bubble over into finding DAG shapes and incentivizing DAG shapes that are going to be performant from the perspective of a wide variety of system configurations.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So that's a wonderful point, right? And so this is the dream, right? The dream is that the first thing that we do is we say, here's our synchrony assumption, right? So we say and when I say synchrony assumption, I'm using it colloquially in that your synchrony assumption could be asynchrony or something. I don't know. But imagine we say, this is how we expect the network to perform and act. And we expect messages to be delivered like this. You can imagine if you're configuring our chain for, a data center, you can expect it to be super reliable and otherwise maybe you can't or something like that, right? And from there, once we have our synchrony assumption, then we're able, hopefully at some point in the future, we'd be able to derive strategies that validators have to fulfill, right? So we have a synchrony assumption, then we're able to derive a specific DAG shape that is live in that specific synchrony assumption. And ideally, it has some nice properties like low overhead, et cetera. It minimizes the amount of overhead and time to finality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So start with a synchrony assumption, generate a DAG, which implicitly is validator strategies, right? Because telling validators they have to build a DAG tells them kind of where they have to build when.
I understand.
Right.
Okay. So.
But I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that I agree with you, and it seems like, to be honest, the research isn't there yet, and I'm I'm pretty worried that if we rush forward with just allowing validators to do whatever the hell they want, we're going to get into some crazy situations. And even more than that, we're just not going to be doing our duty as protocol designers to constrain the hell out of the validators and force them to do what they want. So we get guarantees for users, which is the ultimate goal.
So I agree with that, but that unfortunately doesn't fit with our time constraints here. So I hear you. I hear you on that point of view. I have another set of questions. So with respect to issuing challenges, so this is on the flip side of this. There are 2 lines of questioning that I've been kind of going through in my mind over the last few days. What prevents validators from putting multiple invalid transitions into a block?
Well, I guess I'm not speaking on behalf of the specific scheme that you guys are talking about. I guess in general, validators, if they don't have a right, if they aren't allowed by the protocol through this, allowance of one per block or through this private randomness thing to create invalid transitions. The reason they wouldn't do it is because, we have a thing that punishes validators if they make invalid blocks.
Right. Okay. So then, and how do we select the one that's the D1?
D1 to make the invalid block?
No. How do we select the one that's the invalid transition? So we've got multiple. We want to pick the one that is.
So we're saying that
I don't have I'm
So for the
a validator sitting there. It doesn't and all of the messages it's received has multiple invalid transitions in every possible block. So in that state, how does it go and find the one that is the invalid one and therefore able to slash the validator that received it, or from which it received the message?
Again,
well, I think you would do something like, if there are multiple invalid COM events in a block, then you point out the fact that there are multiple invalid COM events in the block. Right? Because Kyle was saying that you identify a block by a pair. It's hash and it's invalid COM event. So if you identify the block by any of the invalid COM events in there, and also point out the fact that there are multiple, that's enough to say, well, this block is invalid. Let's slash the person who made it.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on implementing the slashing API for multiple because it's obvious with just one. Because the proof is, or at least as I was planning it, was to just submit the entire block itself. And you would run through, if you're another validator that receives it, you would run through the block, and maybe it has multiple invalid transactions, but that's kind of irrelevant. Once you find the first one, you say, yes, that is indeed invalid, and then you move on.
Or in the scheme where every block already has one, as soon as you find the second one, you say, oh, yes, it's invalid.
Yeah, but with an invalid COM event, basically, since it's extra, if you validate the whole block, it'll be obvious what the extra one was. It will be left over, and it won't be obvious until you've basically done all of the code in the block.
Okay, great. That's kind of what I was driving at, was exactly that, right? So if there are multiple and you hit one, then you could be referencing the wrong one. And so now people now people exclude you, right? Because you referenced the wrong one. So you have to.
How could it be wrong?
No, if there are multiple invalid events, the whole block is invalid, and making any reference to it is also invalid. So you just set yourself.
Well, you have to be able to slash for that, right? So not
Exactly.
any reference.
That's right. You have to be able to slash. That's
Yeah,
exactly.
but any
that's my
non-slashing reference to it is itself a slashable offense.
Yes.
So the important point is that you need to be able to find them, and once you've and the next step in this argument, from my point of view, is if you have this capability, then we've already figured out the problem that was bugging us before, which was detecting the validity of the COM events. And so now we can go back to the whole region-based solution. We don't need to do the up and over solution. We can have the entire thing be a lattice of regions, because now we've got everybody motivated to check that that all the transitions are valid, right? So somehow we solved that problem that we felt was insoluble before.
No, that doesn't solve the region problem, because
to me that was the problem with the regions, right?
Yeah, the thing that it doesn't solve is
No. The problem with, so in the lattice structure, if everybody checks, then great. But everyone has to check every shard. So you don't get any load distribution benefits, because everyone has to validate every shard anyway. And so you have to be in all the validator sets. That's the problem with that. Incenting people to check to validate the shards that they're in is not a problem. I mean, if it is, then proof of stake doesn't work at all, right? So So we know we can get people to check. We need a mechanism to verify that they're checking, right? So that they don't cheat. We don't want freeloading. The reason we don't want freeloading is because there's fee splitting of some kind, right? If there's no, to Nate's point, which I, if there's not rewards that are split amongst the pool, then you don't care about freeloading because there's some other kind of work that someone is doing that's useful enough to pay them, right? And you can use the incentives that way.
It seems to me that I have a concern that if we're rewarding creation of blocks, that there's an incentive to create blocks over validating blocks with good justifications. Are we taking care of that?
I think yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the point is like, I'm not saying that we should just arbitrarily reward validators for making blocks. It's just like, five rocks per block, no matter what. I'm saying that, like, depending on what actually ends up being built, we can pay validators or punish validators arbitrarily. If they make blocks where they're supposed to, maybe it's reasonable to pay validators for blocks, and maybe that is good for some reasons.
Right, but Mike's point here is really important, right? Like, at the end of the day, we have just a handful of weeks before we have to produce, a fairly robust description of how validators are going to make money on our network, and what and to be able to write, an investment thesis for people who are considering validation of our chain, we have to be a lot farther along than, there's an arbitrary scheme. Like, we have the ability to do whatever we want because of some theoretical thing. We actually have to have a protocol, right? And so it's not helpful to just say we could be anything you want. We actually have to pick one, right? And that's what we're saying. In our in our view, there's a sort of elegant simplicity to not worrying about block rewards, because block production in itself isn't the useful work. The useful work on our chain is validating the tuple space is correct.
Yeah, but the tuple space exists only because blocks exist. Like, an empty tuple space isn't a particularly useful one. So I hear you in terms of validation being a necessary and useful thing, but block production is clearly also very necessary and very useful. I mean, users would pretty unhappy if we just had a blockchain that didn't make any blocks. And the tuple space was perfectly correct always, but
that's not at all what I was arguing. Don't put words in my mouth.
No, sorry.
Right? Like block production is a function of how much user traffic you get. If you're getting transactions from users, then you're going to have the ability and the desire to produce blocks, because those blocks will contain fees. Whether you split them with other people or not is irrelevant. You have an incentive to produce blocks that contain the transactions you've been sent.
Or
right,
I'm not convinced that it wouldn't be better for you if you forwarded those transactions along to other validators and didn't actually make the blocks yourselves. Like, it's possible the forwarding act is cheaper, and you're getting the same fees in the end in either case because of reward splitting. And so, why don't you just set up a nice little forwarder, pretend to be a validator? You can validate blocks, you can forward transactions, but you don't actually have to go through the act of making any. And therefore, you don't run the risk of equivocation.
The act of making any doesn't cost you anything more than validating them.
Oh,
right? Like, there's no CPU load associated with signing a block of transactions and forwarding it on. It isn't there to forward the transactions along anyway, right? Like,
there's equivocation risk. There's like other things you could possibly be punished for. Signatures aren't free, and also, it seems like strictly less work to me. So if we're going to make an argument about freeloading, it seems like there's a pretty clear strategy of just freeloading up other people, including transactions, if you never have to make blocks and still can make the same rewards. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Like, I hear you in terms of like getting to mainnet and getting to launch, but I think it's pretty clear that both in the things that I'm saying and in the things that you're saying, we do not have rigorous models of this at all, right? And if we go to mainnet too quickly, we're going to shoot ourselves in the feet, because we're going to end up inducing all these very strange side games that, whether or not we have a great investment thesis and it sounds pretty appealing, it turns out, no one's actually validating or no one's actually generating blocks because, it's in their incentive to deviate from the protocol. And so I think like, I hear you, But I really, really, really think that we need to like do much more rigorous analysis on this and really get the research much farther along before we just like rush into some implementation because it sounds simple, but we haven't even analyzed whether or not it's robust under like any notion of robustness. It just like is a hand wavy argument of this sounds reasonable. I to be honest with you, I really don't think it's like good enough for a mainnet. And I think like it's much scarier than just admitting we really don't know what we're doing yet. It's much, much, much scarier. And as an investor, if I really know what I was talking about, I'd be much more scared if I didn't see rigorous analysis. Whether or not that's actually true about investors in the wild is a different question, but I think it's a really important question to say as protocol designers.
Nate, just quickly, are you aware of the reason that Vlad doesn't like sidechains?
Yeah, I mean they make a security compromise most of the time. Like most sidechains have the ability that 51% attacks result in stolen ether. So
on the sidechain or on the main chain?
On the main chain. Like validators, so somehow like the point is that like validators on the main chain kind of have in all these second layer solutions, validators kind of have the ability to steal money by kind of censoring or equivocating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so
So when you say validators, you mean the validators that are validating for the sidechain can steal the ether that's deposited for the purposes of that sidechain, right? They can't steal like outside.
Yeah, so the validators on the sidechain definitely can only steal the sidechain ETH, but more so what I was talking about was the validators on the main chain being able to steal the sidechain ETH. Through censorship and stuff, because all these kind of second layer things rely on interactive games, etc.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a security compromise pretty much, but.
So this is very useful discussion. I think there's clear.
I'm sorry, Greg. Can I? Because the sidechain argument is one where I disagree with Vlad strenuously, and so I think it's important to recognize that while you are trading off certain kinds of security, what you are getting in exchange is performance, and this trade-off is not optional typically. Right. So if you want more strength behind your consensus, your network needs to be more decentralized. That makes it slower. If you want your network to be faster, then you have to accept this kind of trade-off. And that's just physics, right? Like there's no way to design a protocol where that's not the case. And so please don't interrupt me. Part of the objective is to design a protocol that allows users to construct the applications they want to use, right? And as opposed to building a network that is impractical for building the useful applications that users are interested in, but has all of the theoretical characteristics that we would like, right? We want to make sure that there's a balance of those two things, and performance is important to people. A large portion of the interest and the startup founder backing for our chain is based on its projected performance. And so this is a trade-off that, in some sense, we're very happy to make under certain conditions. Yeah, and it's not to say that Vlad is incorrect about the analysis. I think he nails it, but it's just not, as a practical matter, it's not a great place to start your protocol design.
No,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Real quick. I totally agree with you. I don't think we should I don't think we should prohibit people from building sidechains reasonably. I don't even think we can do that. The only point I was making is that, we can spend our time building sidechains, or we can spend our time building a more scalable base layer. I agree with you that there are some trade-offs we can avoid making, but there are strict engineering gains sometimes. They're rare, but they do exist. And I think like there's a real opportunity for us to do that. And I do think they exist. And I think, just the research has to be done. So I totally hear you in terms of like, sometimes trade-offs have to be made. But there's still a lot of improvements we can just make on the base layer. And we kind of have a duty to do that, I'd argue.
So I think this is very good discussion. This is exactly the kind of discussion I was hoping would be had. I still have a number of questions myself, but I think what it means is we have to turn up the heat on this particular issue for the next week or two. because we have to get the issue nailed down, at least for the first for testnet. So we need to turn the heat up on this particular question, and get something that we have team support for. It's also very useful to make sure that we expose these issues to the community so that they understand what the trade-offs we're making are. We have developer stand up. We're 2 minutes late for that, so I've got to jump off. Thanks to everyone. Looking forward to the discussion next week.
Yeah, see you guys next week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Thanks for presenting. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Ciao.